So, how would you like me to start my sermon this morning with the verse that is preceding our Hebrews passage, which reads, "We have much to say about this subject, and it is hard to explain intelligibly since you have become sluggish in understanding." Now, how is that for winning over an audience? You don't want to listen to me, right? But let me tell you briefly about what it is, the process that we go through to write a sermon. One of the important things is to find the pastoral problem. The focus of the passage that is in the scriptures from those many thousands of years ago that apply to us today. And frankly, I wrestled with this. I was certainly not going to start out by insulting you. Even if I did want to bring in some encouragement to you, along with some exhortation, I would need to approach you gently. And then all of a sudden it hit me. I was actually living out the pastoral problem myself. Well, sort of. And this is it. Human nature is wired to avoid conflict and to seek peaceable relationships. Okay, I know this sounds obvious to you. Unless there are a few of you who actually like to stir up dissension and conflict. Of course, that's a problem, right? So, beloved, let me say this. It's only natural that you are going to seek to meet your needs, your physical, your psychological, your social, and spiritual needs. Now, a number of years ago, I read a book called Surfing the Edge of Chaos. Adventure seekers are going to want to surf the edge of chaos, living life as an adrenaline junkie, okay? But even adrenaline junkies shy away from social or psychological conflict. But get this, we as pastors have the responsibility to look at this conflict, places that maybe need to change, and then speak into that situation, calling on years of relationship with the congregation. Alas, that's not me. I've been here a month. So one of the joys of working with youth is that part of my job includes reading websites and things about young people these days. A favorite website called BioLogos that deals with science and faith had led me to some resources on youth ministry, which then led me to the Barna Group. You're probably familiar with them. This is what they wrote. The reasons that young people leave the church. One of their reasons, not necessarily their top, but one of the top ones was they wrestle with the exclusive nature of Christianity. They say, quote, "Younger Americans have been shaped by a culture that esteems open-mindedness, tolerance, acceptance. Today's youth and young adults are also the most eclectic generation in American history in terms of race, ethnicity, sexuality, religion, technological tools, as well as their view of authority. Most young adults want to find areas of common ground with each other, sometimes even if it means glossing over real differences." 3 out of 10 young Christians said churches are afraid of the beliefs of other faiths. And an identical proportion felt that they are forced to choose between faith and my friends. 1/5 of young adults who have a Christian background said that church is like a country club. In other words, only for the insiders. We will be coming back to this later in the sermon. So as we go back to Hebrews, and if you would like to pull out scriptures it's on page 1003 in your pew Bible. We're going to look at what's going on here, but we need to look at what has come before and see the big picture. Because the big picture is all about the high priestly office of Jesus. It's actually quite meaty theology, which the writer spends a good bit of time explaining, okay? But in this section, he's actually addressing a specific problem. Verse 12, "You ought to be teachers, but you need someone to teach you." Now, at this point, we're going to reflect a little bit on teachers. It's what comes to mind when I say the word teachers. Likely, since we're here in church, you're thinking of the Sunday school teachers out there who are now teaching our kids. Or we think of our public or private school teachers who have been hired for their knowledge, their expertise, their training. And this is all fine. But the sense that this passage is talking about is teachers in a much broader understanding, more than just knowledge or training. Because being a teacher means being a leader, someone who knows not just the content, but the teachings, but who has a quality of life that's consistent with the message. So a person becomes a teacher in the church is someone who can publicly proclaim the faith and defend the teachings of the church against anyone who might want to oppose it. Being a teacher means living the message. It's about integrity of life. So in that sense, the challenge to those addressed in the letter is not so much about content, but about living lives of integrity. So our section here does need a little help if we're going to understand the context. And we're not going to know that unless we go to chapter 10, verse 32, and I'll read it for you. But recall the former days, when after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. Now, notice what was happening to them because they had identified with Jesus, who is the only way to a relationship with God. Public exposure, ridicule, affliction, seizure of property. And if they themselves were not facing affliction, the persecution themselves, they would stand with others who were. They would visit them in prison. They would care for them like a family. Now, it's commonly assumed that the community address had failed to mature in faith. Therefore, that's why they required rudimentary instruction. But if you actually look earlier in the letter, you'll see that there is quite a high level of Christian instruction that really corresponds to this adult consumption of solid food. I will define that. Quote, solid food represents Christian truth undergirded by a profound appreciation of Jesus and his work of redemption. That is solid food. So the writer clearly regarded his hearers as mature. That's why they were qualified to be teachers, as it says in 5:12. But they needed to remember their earlier public stance. So the writer's using irony to actually shame his group, to recall them to their conviction and their boldness, which they had had in the past. The community had deviated from this earlier course by becoming sluggish in understanding. The image is that it was hard. So sluggish means also hard of hearing. Their regression to infancy is actually a new development. Now, as a mom, as soon as I think about regression, I can't help but think about my own kids. I have 3 children, so I can tell this story, and you won't know exactly which one I'm talking about, since my oldest 2 are girls. When the baby was born, this older child who was successfully pottying herself a number of months, all of a sudden couldn't remember how to use the potty. She too wanted to wear diapers. Well, in a word, she had regressed to infancy. Now you smile because, of course, that's normal for a child. But this audience is not juvenile. They had been teachers and they had been leaders, but for some reason, they were shrinking back from their earlier stand for the gospel. Shall I repeat to you the pastoral problem? Human nature is wired to avoid conflict. and to seek peace. Let me give you an illustration. I'm reminded of this psychology experiment that I read about while I was in college, mostly now because they've made a movie about it. It's called The Experimenter. I'm reading a synopsis here. At Yale University in 1961, Stanley Milgram designed a psychology experiment in which people think that they are delivering painful electric shocks to this wonderful person strapped to a chair in another room. In actuality, they weren't. But disregarding his pleas for mercy, the majority of the subjects do not stop the experiment, administering what they think are near-fatal electric shocks, simply because they are told to do it. Talking about authority, talking about conformity, it's normal, okay, to do what we can to preserve ourselves. It's normal behavior to conform. And frankly, I find it still shocking to think that the moral integrity of some of the subjects in the experiments couldn't or wouldn't say no. And of course, we think if I were in those shoes, surely I would have stopped this, right? That's our hope. But see, for the audience of the Hebrews, the temptation to sidestep their responsibility in a world that had persecuted them and held them in contempt is understandable. But by sidestepping, their integrity was being called into question. The purpose of this section of Scripture is to remind them of what they have through the gospel. And this is the kind of thing that we can relate to. We live in a culture that has elevated tolerance and acceptance to such a height that even as an individual, it's hard for me to stand on my own convictions. Remember how I started out? One of the reasons that young people leave the church is that they wrestle with the exclusive nature of Christianity. I don't think it's just the young people. We have been shaped by a culture that esteems open-mindedness, tolerance, acceptance. One of the worst kinds of people today is to be a person of conviction. So I know the temptation to say nothing is real. I can't count how many times I bite my own tongue in certain circumstances. I can say that there are a number of times I do it because the context is not right. For example, having arguments on Facebook is counterproductive. That's what I've found. But I would guess that we have all been in situations where we have not been the humble voice of biblical truth in a way that we could have been. And notice I say biblical truth, not political truth. Okay. So has this been depressing you? I want to give you some encouragement. Let's look at chapter 6, verse 9. And onwards. If you keep on reading, there's a big dose of encouragement. But verse 9 says, though we speak in this way, yet in your case, beloved, we feel sure of better things. The writer was persuaded that the community displayed genuine commitment. He knows this because he knows their past. The members of the community had already experienced the stigma that's been attached to them by identifying with Jesus. So I say to you, beloved, even as we looked at this high calling of holding fast to our confession, to stay diligent, to resist the temptation to laziness or fading into the background, or we just try to persevere, we know we can't do it on our own strength. This is like saying to the blind man, Mr. Bartimaeus, you just need to see. You try harder. You work those eyes. Get that brain working. You can do it. Now, does that sound silly to you? I think it does. But the gospel says that we are caught in our own sinfulness. We are blind. We are fallen, and we are just as incapable of seeing as Bartimaeus was. If we were to take a big picture look at how Mark was putting together the gospel, we would see what he was doing here. Several chapters earlier, the disciples were not getting it. They had eyes, but they did not see. They had ears, but they did not hear. They were like our dear friends over here in Hebrews. They were getting sluggish in their understanding. By consequence, they were making these mistakes right and left, jockeying for position, if you remember the gospel from just last week. And then enter this dear Saint Bartimaeus. I want to call him Barty, but that's not nice. He had woken up that day and sat there on the road like any other day, except this day, Jesus, the Son of David, was walking down the road. And when you're blind, you know you need help. And even though he was blind, he could discern that this was Jesus. So it didn't matter how loud he yelled or how foolish he was making himself. He was bound and determined to get Jesus' attention because he knew that Jesus had the power to reorder his entire world. Throwing that cloak aside, treating that begging cloak as the thing of the past, he jumps up and his request, let me see again. Let me see again. I want to recover my sight. Grow me up from being a child. That is our plea towards the living God too, that God would give us the moral teeth in a way to eat meat like a mature child of God yet again. So this is our prayer. Lord, I once could hear you clearly. I once loved you so much that I was willing to die for you. Lord, you know I'm failing in my perseverance and I need your help. Lord, take this blindness, take this stubbornness, take this laziness, this fill in the blank here. I want to see again. And do you know what Jesus says? He says, go. Your faith has made you well. Your faith, which is actually a gift from me to begin with, has been re-energized. You can see again. I give you these teeth, these mature teeth. So to borrow from my sermon in Hebrews several weeks ago, a similar prayer, Jesus, I want you as my champion, by my side, leading the way and making me a teacher and a leader again, a person of integrity. This is what I want. Teeth. Mature teeth. Amen.